China delays its next flagship mission to the moon to next year, Europe invests in homegrown commercial rockets, Rocket Lab tests Neutron's Hungry Hippo fairing again, and SpaceX ends Floridian Starlink launches with Falcon 9 while also reporting a new spaceport in Louisiana. As always, we've got all that and more coming up this week in Spaceflight. The moon race between China and the United States is heating up as both countries make progress towards the next human landing on the moon. And this week, we have major news on both sides. Prior to that next human landing, each country has also set up its own robotic lunar exploration programs. In the US, this is done through the Commercial Lunar Payload Services Contract, also known as CLPS, and in China, it's through the Chang'e program. China has arguably had a lot more success thus far with the Chang'e missions, with every single one meeting their objectives, as opposed to CLPS, which has had only one fully successful mission so far. In fact, the very next Chang'e mission, Chang'e 7, was actually supposed to have launched this week, but then it didn't, and then it got delayed until next year. So what's up with that? Well, Chang'e 7 is a much more complex mission. Chang'e's missions started off with simple orbiters and eventually grew to more complex surface missions, and this one has quite a lot going on. The spacecraft has two main parts, an orbiter and a lander. Both will launch and arrive in lunar orbit together before the lander separates and lands on the lunar surface. The lander is set to land at the Shackleton crater on the lunar south pole, and it will carry a lunar rover, which will be deployed to study the immediate surrounding area. But apart from the rover, the lander will also carry a hopper. This hopper will be deployed on the surface so it can take off and land inside one of the permanently shadowed regions of the Shackleton crater. There, it'll study the water ice that's believed to be inside of these regions. The lander itself will be powered by solar panels, so it has to remain in an area of optimal illumination. But it's landing on the lunar south pole, where the sun is low on the horizon, and the crater ridges can easily block it out for long periods of time every lunar day. Hence, also why there is the potential for water ice. Now, also account for the fact that the moon naturally wobbles as it orbits the Earth, and that the Earth itself orbits the sun and therefore changes some of these angles, and, well, you can start to understand why this mission is a bit more challenging than any of the previous ones. To put it simply, there are just too many specific requirements that limit the times that the spacecraft can land at the desired landing site. According to a paper released in March of 2025 by Fei Zhao and collaborators working at the Chinese Academy of Sciences, the optimal landing period would occur around November of 2026. Beyond that, the sun's elevation gradually goes down until it disappears for a few months of complete darkness at the landing site. Now you might be wondering, if that's when the optimal illumination happens, then why were they launching at the end of August? And that would be a great question. The reason why they were launching 3 months ahead of the landing is because the orbiter part of the spacecraft was meant to study the landing site from orbit to improve its chances of success. This will involve a high-resolution camera for imaging and synthetic aperture radar that will be able to spot things like boulders and other hazardous objects in the area. Because of this, the launch itself also had to line up with the proper phase of the moon so that it could arrive into the proper lunar orbit for all of this research, all while taking into account the performance of the Chang'e 5 rocket that's launching the spacecraft. Thus, the Chang'e 7 mission only had a launch window of a few days this month, or else it had to push even further, and so it did. And the reason is believed to be the fact that the weather just didn't cooperate during this launch window, with 2 separate storms hitting China in the same week. Initially, it was thought this delay could be just 1 month until September, but now it appears, based on comments from Chinese officials, that it's delaying until summer of next year. That is when the sun's elevation at the landing site should go up again and allow for greater mission success. So this could give the US a bit of breathing room when it comes to the robotic race to explore the water ice on the lunar south pole. And now onto the human spaceflight side of things. The race is still quite tight, though China recently disclosed that the demo flight of its Mengjiao lunar spacecraft is now delayed into next year, so we'll have to wait and see what happens with that as well. The United States' Artemis program also had quite a few news stories this week, so let's cover those as well, starting with the very next mission, Artemis III. While this mission is not going to the moon, it'll be testing the lunar modules alongside Orion and a crew of 4, so it's still quite a big deal. The mission is currently planned to occur no earlier than June of 2027, but of course, to get there, the rockets need to be assembled. NASA began stacking the SLS rocket for this mission in July, starting off by placing the first pair of segments of the 5-segment solid rocket boosters on the mobile launcher. Then, a few weeks later, they installed the aft center segments, which go right above the aft segments. This week, NASA released pictures showing the next pair of segments being stacked on the mobile launcher, adding the center segments for each booster. These are also the segments that have the iconic NASA worm logo. 2 more segments still remain to complete the booster's motor section, and these will be topped off by the nose cone and forward skirt sections, which have already gone inside the agency's vehicle assembly building. While that's happening inside High Bay 3 of the VAB, High Bay 2 is preparing the rocket's core stage for flight. The tank section of this core stage arrived from New Orleans back in the spring and was mated to the engine section shortly thereafter. And this week, teams began installing the 4 RS-25 engines that will power the stage during flight. The latest images released by NASA show at least 2 engines, engines 2 and 3, going into the engine section of SLS, and the other 2 engines could follow not long after that. While that's going on inside of the vehicle assembly building, teams at the Operations and Checkout building at the Kennedy Space Center completed umbilical connections between the Orion spacecraft for this mission and its European service module. Engineers were able to power up the crew module using the umbilicals for the first time, making sure that there was a good electrical connection between both modules. At the same time, teams at NASA's Marshall Spaceflight Center in Alabama have been preparing the spacer that will be installed in place of the interim cryogenic propulsion stage, an upper stage that won't be needed and thus won't be flown on this mission. After finishing welding the spacer a few weeks ago, teams have now added the forward ring that will connect the bottom of the spacer to the SLS launch vehicle stage adapter. That is the conical section that acts as an interstage. Another ring will be welded to the other end of the barrel in order to connect to the Orion stage adapter, which teams are also working on in parallel at Marshall. As we covered in a previous episode, for Artemis III, NASA intends to use the structural test articles for the launch vehicle stage adapter and the Orion stage adapter, therefore preserving the original adapters for the Artemis IV mission. Now, these haven't been used for years, so they are a bit rough around the edges and need some additional work prior to them launching on this mission. This week, NASA released pictures of teams working on the Orion adapter, which will be receiving paint and insulation prior to installation on SLS next year. NASA is also making progress on SLS rockets for the next few Artemis missions. This week, the agency released pictures and video of the liquid hydrogen tank for the 4th SLS core stage following the successful completion of proof testing. The testing, which occurred at the agency's Michoud assembly facility in New Orleans, actually ended last month, but NASA didn't publish this until this week, a common occurrence these days. With proof testing complete, the tank will next be cleaned and prepared for further outfitting as it progresses through production. The 4th core stage is set to fly on the Artemis IV mission in 2028, which should be followed by the Artemis V mission, hopefully not long after. NASA recently released pictures of the rocket's engine section barrel being moved into the vertical assembly center at Michoud. Here, it'll be outfitted with the connection ring that will be used to mate it to the core stage liquid hydrogen tank. The SLS engine section is, of course, the most complex part of the rocket, so it's the one that's the furthest ahead in construction. What's interesting is that, apparently, NASA has also started production of the core stage for Artemis VI. Officially, the agency is supposed to transition to commercial alternatives past Artemis V in order to send its astronauts to lunar orbit. So seeing SLS hardware for Artemis VI is a bit of a mixed signal. It could be that long lead manufacturing has started for a just-in-case situation. For instance, what if commercial alternatives aren't ready to take over after Artemis V? Well, having hardware for an Artemis VI could be interesting. Now, in particular, the hardware that's been manufactured is one of those connecting rings that I mentioned for some of the hardware earlier in this section. Once completed, this one should be welded to the engine section of Core Stage 6 if it gets to that point in construction. Once again, with the sort of mixed signals that we're getting, it's unclear whether we'll see this hardware going through to completion, but we'll be keeping a close eye out for future updates. Europe just took a big step towards shaking up its launch industry. The European Space Agency has awarded the first contracts in a program to help a few European rocket startups get off the ground. Literally. The European Launcher Challenge was set up to give Europe competitive access to space by developing innovative and cost-effective launchers and encouraging competition. And the program proved very popular, much more so than ESA expected. In November of last year, the space ministers of ESA's member states got together to decide on the agency's funding for the next 3 years, which included allocating money for the European Launcher Challenge. The agency had proposed 420 million euros for the program, but ended up raising more than twice that at over 900 million. ESA is now putting these funds to good use and has awarded the first challengers their contracts. So, who are the challengers? Well, they were first announced last summer, before the program was even funded. First, there's Germany's rocket factory Augsburg with its RFA-1 rocket. Launching from Scotland's Saxevord spaceport in the Shetland Islands, the rocket should be able to deliver 500 kilograms to sun-synchronous orbit, or SSO. They're currently gearing up for their first launch attempt, which might lift off just weeks from now. RFA was awarded 186.9 million euros, primarily backed by Germany, with additional contributions from the UK. Meanwhile, their German colleagues at Isar Aerospace entered the race with Spectrum. The rocket is designed to deliver 700 kilograms to SSO, or 1,000 to low Earth orbit. They've already done one launch attempt, which didn't get too far, but Spectrum is now awaiting its second launch from Norway's Andøya spaceport. It might happen soon, but we've also said that for most of the year. Anyway, their contract is worth 197.8 million euros, mostly from Germany, but Austria and Norway chipped in too. Next, there's Spain's PLD Space with its Miura 5 rocket, which they're also working to get ready for a launch this year. They plan to deliver up to 540 kilograms to SSO, launching from South America, from Europe's spaceport in French Guiana. To make it happen, ESA awarded PLD a 158.9 million euro contract backed by Spain, with Germany contributing as well. Finally, there's Maya Space, the only company that hasn't been awarded a contract yet, but according to ESA, that's still in the works. Maya is a notable player as it's a subsidiary of European space industry giant Ariane Group. While all these companies have future plans for reusability, Maya has already designed its first rocket to be reusable. With its 500 kilograms to SSO payload capacity, it's in line with the other contestants in its reusable configuration, but expendable, it should be capable of lofting 1,500 kilograms. Either way, they'll hopefully get to sign their contract soon. Now, there used to be a fifth company in the running, but the program is down that extra player. Scotland's Orbex went bankrupt earlier this year, so no contract for them, obviously. And thus, with the first contracts now awarded, the European Launcher Challenge has officially kicked off, and next up, we should start seeing some launches. But that's where this might become a real challenge. The program requires the challengers to achieve orbit before 2028. Some of them have launch experience already. While not getting too far, Isar has already made one unsuccessful orbital attempt, and as mentioned, is now gearing up for a second, which will hopefully get even farther. Meanwhile, PLD has flown a successful mission with its suborbital Miura 1, but whether or not that translates to a smooth path towards orbit with Miura 5 still remains to be seen. Meanwhile, RFA is currently gearing up for its first flight, which should give them plenty of time for a second attempt if needed, although they took a long time to recover from a failure earlier in the program. But Maya expects its first attempt at reaching orbit no earlier than the second half of 2027. They're certainly cutting it close. There's definitely still time for all of them to get that orbital flight done, but the deadline is looming in under 1.5 years. That's a very short amount of time in spaceflight. Just a few setbacks could put that target out of reach for some, or worst case, all of them. But obviously, we are rooting for all 4 challengers in the race, and they all seem to have a credible path towards success, which means more launches for us to watch. Will they all get there? There's only one way to find out. Hit the subscribe button so you don't miss any updates, and watch along with us every step of the way. Rocket Lab has taken its hungry hippo out to grab a bite. Of course, I am talking about the payload fairings for Neutron, the company's upcoming reusable medium-lift rocket. Neutron's approach to fairing reusability is completely different than what we've seen so far from the likes of SpaceX and Blue Origin. Instead of recovering the fairings separately, they'll remain attached to the first stage for the entirety of its flight, up to space and all the way back down. To make this possible, the hungry hippo fairings and the massive interstage that they attach to encapsulate Neutron's second stage and the payloads entirely. When it's time for stage separation, the fairings simply open for a short period to allow the second stage to escape. Then they'll close again to be recovered with the first stage as one unit. Upon landing, Neutron should look exactly the same as it did on liftoff, so seeing this beast launch and land will definitely be a sight. But it's also a challenge. Separation needs to be very precise to ensure that the stages won't bump into each other mid-action, so Rocket Lab has performed many tests, some of which we saw with qualification units last year. Over in New Zealand, they've performed tests using a contraption to pull a second stage out of the cylindrical section of the fairing and the interstage. This week, they showed a video of the flight hardware for the first mission in action outside of the company's Neutron production site in Virginia near the Wallops Flight Facility, where Neutron will eventually lift off. Just a few weeks ago, they'd already decked out the fairing with its thermal protection system, control surfaces, avionics, and fluid systems, so at this point, it pretty much seems like a flight-ready machine, and Rocket Lab says they've tested it under flight-like conditions. The stack has since moved back into the hangar, where it's waiting for Neutron's interstage to arrive. Once it does, the stack will be placed on top, and the whole assembly will then attach to the first stage, ready for flight. That final step may still take a while, though, as the Flight 1 first stage is still in production. The company has had a few setbacks with the program this year, destroying the first stage tank and the interstage during separate tests. Regardless, they're still pushing for a launch this year, and CEO Peter Beck repeated this a couple weeks ago. It seems tight though. The first stage is set to arrive at the pad in the final quarter of the year, and then it has to be successfully static fired before the company can even think of stacking the whole rocket and launching. A lot has to go right for them to be able to pull this off before the end of the year. So yeah, forgive us for being a little bit skeptical about their timelines, but we would love to be proven wrong. Now we'll take a look at some other stories across space, starting with a dead end for a European rocket. The European Space Agency announced that Ariane 6 will not be developed any further. The rocket was going to get a Block 3 version with a lightweight carbon composite-based upper stage, but that is now cancelled. Instead, mission planners will have to make do with Ariane 6 Block 2, which added a 10% performance increase with its slightly stretched solid rocket boosters. But why? Well, apparently Ariane 6 has been performing very well, and the performance increases that Block 3 would offer might not be needed after all, so it might not really make sense to continue developing Ariane 6. Europe is also working on new rockets, we talked about them earlier in this episode, and all of them are designed to be much more competitive than Ariane 6. None of the current designs match Ariane 6's capabilities, but most European launcher challenge companies have much bigger plans. So why continue iterating on a rocket when its replacements are already appearing on the horizon? Now, this doesn't mean that it's the end of the road for Ariane 6 just yet. ESA confirmed to our friends at European Spaceflight that it will still see a few upgrades, like a lighter aft bay for the core stage, squeezing out more performance. There's also the Astris space tug coming up in a few years, which is specifically designed to fly on Ariane. With Block 3 going away, they also have to modify Ariane 6 for Europe's Argonaut lunar landers, which carry a radioisotope heating unit running on Americium-241. These radioactive payloads require some additional safety measures that Block 3 would have been compliant with. Reportedly, they might even upgrade Ariane 6 for human spaceflight. Now, that's not something that ESA is actively working on right now, but apparently it is still on the table. Whatever happens, it's all but certain that the European launch market will look very different eventually. NASA is opening Pandora's box. Not in the metaphorical sense, and not in the literal sense either. But the agency's Pandora telescope has now started its science observations. Pandora is a small telescope with a diameter of only 45 centimeters. The small satellite launched into low Earth orbit on January 11th on SpaceX's Twilight rideshare mission and has since been commissioned. With the instruments performing as they should, it's now officially begun its science mission of studying exoplanets in visible and near-infrared light. Observing exoplanets is hard, and Pandora is going to do it by studying their transits, when the planet moves in front of its star from our perspective. During these transits, the planet slightly alters the starlight that we can see, allowing scientists to infer all sorts of things about the planet's size and composition. While this method is very common, it's not perfect, as the signals from the star and planet are mixed. Over the next year, Pandora will observe 20 planets 10 times for 24 hours each time, specifically to disentangle these signals. And that could ultimately help scientists to more accurately interpret observations made with other telescopes like the James Webb Space Telescope. And hey, did you know that Pandora's near-infrared sensor is actually a spare detector from Webb? Very resourceful, NASA! And now let's continue with another telescope that reuses parts, specifically a spare mirror from the U.S. National Reconnaissance Office. NASA's Nancy Grace Roman Space Telescope has arrived at its launch site. In just a few days, a Falcon Heavy will lift off from Launch Complex 39A at the Kennedy Space Center to give the agency's next great space telescope a ride to space. We've been following along as NASA assembled the telescope and prepared it for flight. Amazingly, they are running ahead of schedule and are under budget. That's a rare achievement in spaceflight, but certainly not one that we can complain about. This week, teams closed the two halves, making up Falcon Heavy's payload fairing around the telescope. The protective shell will keep the spacecraft safe on the way up, isolating it from sound and aerodynamic pressure, as well as the heat generated by friction as the rocket accelerates through the atmosphere. Later in the week, Roman moved out of the payload hazardous servicing facility where it had been prepped for flight. The first leg of its trip didn't need to go too far, though, as it stopped at LC-39A. There, it'll be attached to Falcon Heavy, which will take it the rest of the way to space. Eventually, the telescope will reach Sun-Earth Lagrange Point 2, from where it will observe the universe using its incredibly wide field of view to try and unravel the nature of dark matter and dark energy, study exoplanets, do all kinds of infrared astronomy, and probably create more questions than answers. That's just how science tends to go, but hopefully it'll also answer a few questions in the process too. But before that, launch! Teams from NASA, Roman, and SpaceX just pulled go for a launch attempt on Sunday, August 30th. The two Falcon Heavy side boosters will also perform return-to-launch site landings, so we've got quite a spectacle coming up. Of course, there are even more launches coming up, but first let's take a look at what happened this week in your weekly space traffic report provided by Next Spaceflight. We had 6 launches this week, 3 of them from the United States, and the other 3 came from Russia, China, and Europe. The launch from China was the second flight of the Chang'e 6C, a variant of the Chang'e 6A, without its solid rocket boosters that debuted back in 2024. That said, just a few days after its launch, the spent upper stage of this rocket, which had been left in orbit, suffered a fragmentation event, leaving behind hundreds of small fragments. Thankfully, these events are generally not too common, but for this particular family of rockets, the Chang'e 6, it's now the 5th such event since 2022. In those previous occasions, it was the upper stage of the Chang'e 6A, but the upper stage on 6C is more or less the same, just a bit thinner. So clearly, given this track record, something's not going right with these upper stages. The Russian launch took place from Plesetsk with a Soyuz 2.1B carrying a GLONASS K1 satellite, part of the country's own satellite navigation system. From French Guiana, we had a rumble in the jungle with an Ariane 6 launch that placed the MTG-I2 weather satellite into a geosynchronous transfer orbit. MTG-I2 stands for Meteosat Third Generation Imager 2, and it's the second of the imaging satellites of the third generation of Meteosat weather satellites. Once in operation, it'll operate under the name of Meteosat 14. The 3 launches from the United States were SpaceX launches with its Falcon 9 rocket, all of them Starlink missions. One of them, Starlink Group 1049, was notable for a couple of reasons. The first being that it launched using booster B1067 in its 37th flight, marking a new record for most flights of a Falcon booster. But perhaps more importantly, it also marked the last launch of Starlink satellites on board Falcon 9 rockets from the Florida Space Coast. The company is phasing them out in favor of Starlink launches on Starship from Florida, which could begin as early as later this year or early next. Now, that doesn't mean that Falcon 9 has completely stopped launching Starlink satellites altogether. The company will continue to launch them on Falcon 9 rockets from Vandenberg in California, where they can be placed into polar orbits that are harder to access from Florida without a huge performance penalty. Even Starship will have to wait a bit until it's able to do those kinds of polar missions without taking a performance hit. So, who knows? Maybe Vandenberg Starlinks will continue not just for a few more months, but maybe even years, or at least until Starship has an easier way to access polar orbits. But even that may not take too long, given that this week, SpaceX announced that it's planning to invest $100 billion into its own private spaceport in Louisiana, which could theoretically access polar orbits by flying straight south over the Gulf. We covered this whole story over on our second channel, Breaking Space, so be sure to check that out after this video if you want the full rundown. Oh, and obviously, we'll be keeping track of this second starbase through our weekly Starship update episodes. While all of those launches were headed up to space, up on the International Space Station, NASA astronaut Anil Menon and ESA astronaut Sophie Adano conducted another 6.5-hour spacewalk. The spacewalk was part 2 of the laborious task of replacing a large space-to-ground antenna on the outside of the station. The full operation was meant to have been done in a single spacewalk, but difficulties encountered during the removal of the older antenna forced teams to move the installation of the antenna to a separate spacewalk, which was completed this week. Next week, we'll have yet another spacewalk on the ISS, with Adeno again venturing outside of the orbiting outpost, this time accompanied by NASA astronaut Jessica Meir. The astronauts will be replacing reflectors used for docking of commercial crew vehicles to the station and will conduct several other maintenance and upgrade tasks on other parts of the station. In deep space, the Bepi Colombo mission from the European Space Agency and the Japan Aerospace Exploration Agency will have a major milestone this coming September 3rd. The separation of the Mercury Transfer Module from the Mercury Planetary Orbiter and the Mercury Magnetosphere Orbiter. With the spacecraft finally arriving at Mercury in November, it'll no longer need the transfer module that's been providing all the propulsion while in orbit around the Sun, so the module will be separated and discarded prior to arrival. Down on the ground, a series of launches are getting ready to head spaceward next week. The star of the week will be the launch of NASA's Nancy Grace Roman Space Telescope on board Falcon Heavy, which we previewed earlier. Needless to say, we'll be covering that launch, and another reminder to watch out for the double booster landing and listen out for the sonic booms if you're in the area. A Falcon 9 is also expected to launch from Vandenberg with a Starlink mission carrying yet another batch into orbit. Rocket Lab also has a launch of its Electron rocket from New Zealand scheduled, carrying another Strix satellite for Synspective. From India, a GSLV Mark II is also planned to launch the EOS-5 Earth observation satellite into geosynchronous transfer orbit. Given the rough weather in China in recent days, launches from China may be more rare next week, but we might have the debut flight of Galactic Energy's Pallas 1 rocket. This rocket is planned to be reusable with propulsive landing, so it's just one more in the long list of reusable rockets from China that are trying to make their way to the top. And if all goes well, we may also have the launch of Isar Aerospace's Spectrum rocket from Andøya, Norway on the Onward and Upward mission. Right now, all we have is a notification from the Andøya spaceport indicating that launch activities are planned for next week, with hazard zones that appear to be for an orbital rocket. So who knows if schedules will hold. But don't forget, you can regularly visit nextspaceflight.com or download the Next Spaceflight app on your phone to keep tabs on the launch schedule and find out all of the latest updates and shifts if they occur. And that's your weekly update of spaceflight news. I'm Alicia Siegel for NSF, and we'll see you all again next week to recap this week in spaceflight.